and welcome to our Sunday service here at Alive Church. Alive is a multi-site church and we are based in 5 locations.
Every week we have worship by our Alive worship team and the word is brought by one of our pastors here at Alive.
I raise a hallelujah in the presence of my enemies. I raise a hallelujah louder than the unbelief. I raise a hallelujah
stand amazed at all the things you've done. I stand amazed at your love and faithfulness. I'm in wonder, awestruck wonder of you, God. I stand amazed in mercies every day. I stand amazed. Your word has never changed. I'm in wonder, awestruck wonder of you, God. I'm not afraid, for Jesus counts my days. I'm not alone. You walk the path before me. This I know, that you are in control. I will lift up my hands and say, every blessing I'll turn back to praise. I'm not afraid. I stand amazed at the foot of Calvary. I stand amazed that the pain was all for me. I'm in wonder, awestruck wonder of you, God. I stand amazed that the snow has rolled away. I stand amazed that you're coming back again. I'm in wonder, awestruck wonder of you, God. I'm not afraid, for Jesus counts my days. I'm not alone. You walk the path before me. This I know, that you are in control. I will lift up my hands and say, every blessing I'll turn back to praise. I will not fear all the earth give way. He is my refuge, He is my strength. I will not fear all the terror of night, because His angels to be by my side. I will not fear all the earth give way. He is my refuge, He is my strength. I will not fear all the terror of night, because His angels to be by my side. I'm not afraid, for Jesus counts my days. I'm not alone. He walks the path before me. This I know, that you are in control. As I lift up my hands and say, every blessing I'll turn back to praise.
Now we are going to hear the word from one of our location pastors.
Let's hear from them now.
Well, we're into the second part of our Signs of the Kingdom series, and this week we're talking about when the kingdom of heaven comes in all its fullness, justice and righteousness reign on the earth. And we've taken this from Isaiah 61. I just want to remind you, when Jesus announced his ministry in the temple, he unrolled the scroll and he read from the ancient words of the prophet Isaiah in his proclamation of the year of the Lord's favour. It goes like this: "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor." This is a sign of the kingdom. When the kingdom comes, God's presence is amongst us. He sent me to bind up the broken-hearted. Salvation and deliverance and healing is there. To proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners. Righteousness and justice. When the kingdom comes, that reigns. And to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. Another word for favour is shalom, so peace is another sign of the kingdom. And the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. So comfort is a sign of the kingdom. And provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. When the kingdom of heaven comes, joy reigns. So we're talking about justice and righteousness today. I don't know if you've ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. I remember as a really little girl sitting on the sofa with my dad watching the footage in the 80s of the Ethiopian famine, and tears trickling down my face because I felt a sense of powerlessness. This is too big, too much. How do we ever help in this context? Well, let's look at what the Bible says about injustice. I'm going to read from Matthew 21, where Jesus comes into the temple and cleanses it. It says this in verse 12. Jesus entered the temple and he drove out all who sold and bought in the temple. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers." So as I was growing up, I understood the story of this to mean that as Jesus came into the temple, he was shocked as it had become a place of commerce. I understood it to be Jesus saying, we don't have business in the temple. Buying and selling is forbidden. This is a house of worship, and so we make space for it to be sacred. I understood it to mean that there was no space for commerce or business in sacredness. Well, that sounds really nice, but it's not actually accurate. Jesus wouldn't have been surprised in the slightest to find money changers and sellers of sacrificial offerings in the courts of the temple. Jerusalem, like all other ancient temples, had developed, and it was more than a religious building or a house of worship. It was actually fundamentally an economic institution. In fact, it dominated the city's commercial life. During festivals and pilgrimages, visitors to the temple would be required to pay a tax, the annual half-shekel tax, and currency exchange and collection stations would have been essential to help that happen. So the mere presence of money changers and their booths wasn't anything shocking or offensive. So pilgrims would be required to make sacrifices, and so they'd need to purchase a spotless animal that they couldn't carry with them on their journey. And so they would be buying and selling those animals in order for them to make sacrifices. The temple was also a primary centre of Jewish political power in the city, and so in that sense it was more like the Vatican in the Middle Ages than just a big church. The high priest was a major political leader, and he was usually allied with the Romans or even set up by them. And so the political leaders, both the Romans and their puppet kings, would have been known that good favour for the temple was mutually beneficial for both of them. So that's one reason why we've got people buying and selling in the temple. But here's the clincher. All of this was taking place in the world where the poor people of Judah, including those from Nazareth and Galilee, where Jesus was from, were being oppressed and marginalised and burdened with taxation to near breaking point. Most of them were living at subsistence level, barely able to afford the necessities. to the point that 1 year of bad harvest could potentially ruin them. Hence the need for loans from the temple so that they could buy their animal to make their sacrifice. So this is an act of protest and resistance from Jesus. With that in mind, it's really telling but not surprising that the primary focus of Jesus' anger in all of the accounts are the money changers and those who are selling doves. Let me tell you about the doves. The doves were the primary sacrifice bought by the poor, who were routinely exploited by the system of the religious aristocracy. Whatever worship through sacrifices to honour God had originally meant, it become twisted in so many ways. It was now business. It was a predatory monopoly. In fact, since the temple was the only place to be able to offer legitimate worship, the money changers and the dove sellers represented concrete mechanisms of oppression within a political economy that doubly exploited the poor and the unclean. So what did Jesus do? He marched in and he disrupted the proceedings. He flipped the tables. He cleared the courts. He wouldn't allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. It's hard to know the scope of this protest, but it was definitely a protest. I can picture his disciples helping him in an image not too far removed from crowds of people marching and shutting down major intersections of places of commerce in today's world. Jesus' disruption of the temple market wasn't a protest about people selling things in a house of worship. It was a clear act of resistance against a corrupt and exploitative system, which he called a den of thieves. It was a protest about the misuse of power, a protest against injustice. Clearing the temple was disruptive and highly controversial. It wasn't a peaceful protest. This was a direct intervention to halt commerce and to stop the business of any sort. The businesses targeted were those of the establishment, not of the lay people. So it's more like going for a big governmental structure than it is Steve's shop on the corner of the high street. The anger Jesus felt and the harsh words he said came from prayerful contemplation and a prophetic critique of injustice that is filled in the Hebrew scriptures. It's more than just down with the system. It's really importantly God's house, the place where God's presence is. People, as well as a building, should not be a den of thieves. It should not be a place where people are oppressed. It should be a place of prayer and worship. The incident was followed in the Gospels by numerous teachings explaining how the establishment had misused its authority. You see, Jesus wasn't a man of privilege. He was one of the poor and the oppressed. He was fighting for. We often forget this with our whitewashed, spotless and blemished portraits of Jesus or our high theology. But he came from a backwater town in Galilee, home of many of the overburdened peasants that he described above. He was a victim of discrimination. One of his own disciples scoffed at him at first and said, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" He had a distinct regional accent and people in Jerusalem knew where they were just from hearing about it. This protest that Jesus came in with got him killed. It was dangerous, it was a huge risk, and it was an act of incredible vulnerability. So Jesus, he was full of power and authority, but he used his power and his authority to serve the poor and the oppressed and to turn and change the systems that were marginalising and causing that oppression. I want to tell you a little bit about a system or a model of power and vulnerability that's really inspired me and helped me to think about how I use my power and my own risk-taking for the sake of other people. So this is a model of power and vulnerability written by someone called Andy Crouch. He's one of my favourite authors, and it's really helped me to develop my thinking on how we as the church can engage with the world in order to bring down injustice and to allow people to flourish. So Andy Crouch uses this 2x2 chart with this line being power and this line being vulnerability or risk-taking. And as I've studied the Gospels, every single encounter I think that Jesus has with people, he expresses really strong power. Andy Crouch defines power as the capacity for meaningful action and really strong vulnerability. So he defines vulnerability as a capacity for meaningful risk. So let's talk about these quarters here. Lots and lots of power, but no capacity for meaningful risk leads to exploitation. This is what we see in international governments. We see it with really powerful people where they don't use their power for other people, but they just keep their power to themselves. People end up being exploited. No power and no vulnerability leads to safety and withdrawal. It's where we hide away and say, I don't even want to face these issues. I'm not going to do anything about this. High vulnerability but low power leads to poverty or suffering or even death. It's where we say we can't do anything about this, but we're fully at risk and fully exposed to the elements around us. But this is where Jesus is. Jesus is always high authority and power. He knows who he is, but he always uses his power and steps out for other people's flourishing. He exposes himself. He takes risk. You see this in the temple courts. He's risking his life, and you see it on the cross, the ultimate show of full power and full vulnerability. As we move up and to the right, we create our flourishing for ourselves and flourishing for other people. And this is what Jesus did when he was in the temple courts. This is what he does when he proclaims the kingdom of heaven is at hand. What he's saying as we are the ambassadors of his kingdom is commissioning us to be full of the power of the Spirit of God, to be the people that he's made us to be secure in our identity as image bearers, as children of the Most High, and to extend and expand his kingdom full of power, but not hiding away, not pretending that we don't have power, but taking risks on behalf of other people. And so there's an invitation today for us, Alive Church. I believe that if Jesus was here in the room right now, he would be inviting us as a church to take up the authority that he gave us in Matthew 28 when he said go, and to take risks on behalf of other people. Will you accept that invitation today like Jesus? Let me tell you about people who I've seen accept that invitation. Malala, who was shot in the head as a small Afghan young woman, and came to the UK to fight for justice, for the education and the rights of women. Nelson Mandela, who was in jail and fought the apartheid in South Africa for generations actually, and became the premier in South Africa to see apartheid changed and to see a culture change happen. Stacey Marriott, who's in our church, she, experiencing her own mental health challenges, stands with the authority that God's given her, but takes risks for other people and has set up a whole network of nightlight cafes across our city and now into the county of Lincolnshire. And Paul and Jane Arnold, who are a wonderful family in Alive Lincoln Central, who use their power or their sense of privilege, and they open up their home for foster children after foster children, for people, for young little ones who are really vulnerable and at risk. I think there's some amazing examples of people who have said yes to the invitation to use their power or their authority, but to take risks at the same time. So I want to ask you as we finish, what would it look like for you to use your sense of authority or power and to step out and expose yourself to risk in order to see change happen in the world for the flourishing of the people around you? Might look like fighting for climate change or for race equality. Might look like standing up against violence against women and girls. Could look like raising your voice against the implications of the cost of living crisis. could just look like being in the office and standing up for someone who's been gossiped about when they're not in the room and saying, no, that's not fair, that's not what they said, or that's not what they're really like. I'd love to invite you to invite the Holy Spirit now. As you ruminate on the actions of Jesus, turning over the tables and standing up for the poor and the oppressed, what does it look like for you to be a person made in his image, advancing the kingdom with the sign of justice and righteousness, so that people can flourish and our cities and towns can be changed?
Thank you for joining with us today. I hope you enjoyed connecting with us.
If you'd like to respond to today's message or find out any more about Alive, then please connect with us via our website or on social media.
And now we are going to listen to one more song, and we are looking forward to connecting with you next week.
I love you, Lord. Oh, your mercy never fails me. And all my days I've been held in your hands. From the moment that I wake up until I lay my head, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. 'Cause all my life you have been faithful, and all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the good.